Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And I was catching up with my friend Teresa not that long ago. And we were talking about making some pretty big personal development changes. And I said, okay, so she listens to the Personality Hacker Podcast. I asked, if we were to do one on any subject, what would you like us to do a podcast on? And she said, having patience through these changes. Basically, how do you survive when it doesn't feel like you can make changes, or when you can make changes, but they're going slowly? Like, how do you, as you're making these changes to free up your psychological energy and your emotional energy, and you know that the changes are eventually going to be positive for you, but right now you're still feeling stuck in the same habits, or feel stuck in the same context or situation. How do you survive that situation? How do you have patience through those big transition time periods?
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about this. I think in our personal life too, this is something that's been on our radar. You'll probably hear from me about 5 million times a week where I'm like, why is this not figured out yet in my life? Like, why do I have this keep coming up? And I want to have it handled, and I'm frustrated, and things aren't happening as fast as I want them to happen, especially around personal growth. Like right now I'm working on some personal growth stuff, and it's like, it feels like I'm on this treadmill of never ending just work, and I don't see solutions. And I'm like, you almost feel like you want to give up at that point.
Yeah. Well, and it really does feel like things take forever. And especially, I think we get this idea that anything that isn't concrete and tangible, anything that feels more abstract, should be more, it should have more flexibility. It should be quicker. It should be a faster pace, because you don't have the same limitations of the physical, tangible world. But when it comes to altering the neural connections in your mind, where all of this is living, basically, like everything is actually in a mainframe that has, physical limitations, which is your brain. Your brain actually like makes different neural pathways. And when you're making a change, a habit change, or a transition, even if it is entirely just completely psychological, let's pretend it's just changing a narrative around life, right? It's not actually making a change in your life in a physical, tangible way. It's just altering the story you're telling yourself. You still actually have a physical component there. There are still neural pathways that are being sort of rewired and reallocating your thought patterns. And so there actually always is a physical, tangible component to it. That said, generally when we're making a major change in our life, there are almost always going to be like physical, tangible results, or we're going to see differences in our life. Like, let's say that one of the things that we want to change is our relationship to other people, right? Like we want to have better relationships. We want to have, better friendships, or higher quality, lovers, or whatever it is, or love relationships. That actually has a physical, tangible, concrete component, which is the other people in your life. And so it might take time to orchestrate, meetups, or it might take time to orchestrate hanging out with them to gain greater intimacy, or the time it takes to actually have those conversations. So almost everything when it comes to personal development actually has sort of a logistical limitation to it. And so the patience we need is the patience to recognize that no matter what you do in life, if you're building anything, it's going to take some time to manifest. If you were going to build a house, you wouldn't expect it to, like, as soon as you manifest the idea of building a house in your brain, look over and expect it to have just whelmed in front of you. You actually have a lot of planning phases. You have a lot of orchestration. You actually have the building of it. So the things in our personal development lives mirror that, in the sense that it takes time to do anything.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to, it's basically a latency issue. It seems like the stuff we do in the external world doesn't have as much latency to it. You want to build a house, you drop the plans. The plans are a physical thing. You go get the materials, you put the house together, you actually construct it together, and it's built. Whereas when we're doing stuff in personal development, we're working on our minds, we're working on our hearts, we're working on the ways we see things. It's sometimes, first of all, it's not a direct path. Sometimes there's a lot of things that we're not sure. Is this working? Is this not? Some test iterate, because it's not so clear as building a house. So we've got to do a lot of test iterating. And then a lot of it, and we've referenced this on podcasts before, is you make choices now that are going to inform the choices that come later. So there's this latency of, I'm working on this now, and I might not see it show up for a while. And so I can't I can hammer a nail into a board and put a wall up and then step back that evening and look at the wall I just created. But sometimes the same metaphor of, building a wall in your mind or changing the structure of your mind, it's so far removed from when we see the result. There is a tangible element, but it's not as direct. So you don't know, wait, was that the thing that caused this to happen? Or was it something completely different? Was it circumstantial? It's not as directly tied. So it's very difficult to make those matches and see, okay, I'm doing this thing now, and then I'm getting this result later.
Yeah. Now, and another component to it, I think, too, is that a lot of these are disciplines. And so the changes are not as obvious. It's kind of almost like raising a child where, if you aren't around a little kid for a while, it may be 3 to 6 months, and you've got a toddler, the difference between, where they were at 2.5 versus where they're at 3 is huge if you haven't seen them, right? You're like, oh my gosh, your verbal skills are so much better. Look at your mobility. Oh, your coloring is so much more controlled. Like, it's just really obvious if you haven't been around it. But if you've actually been in the child's life, the changes are so subtle and the disciplines are so subtle that sometimes it's hard to really notice it until you go, oh, wait, I remember. Maybe you watch a video of the kid at 2.5 and you're like, wow, she, the case of our child, Piper, I'm like, wow, she's really developed in the last 6 months. I didn't even really recognize it because it happened so slowly. And it was based on these disciplines that are growing, right? Like she's gaining greater mobility or, greater dexterity or whatever, but it happens so slowly that sometimes you don't see it. So you get impatient, right? You're like, oh, why can't you be faster along in potty training? Forgetting the fact that she wasn't necessarily even equipped to do potty training a year ago or not even close to it, doing it this quickly. And we can sort of forget that. So I think in our personal development world, we're living our life every day and we're growing these disciplines, and sometimes we don't see the results because we're living the results. They're so subtle. They're like having these little subtle pieces. So it's not, or these subtle parts are not showing up as maybe with huge clarity as they would if we maybe weren't hanging out with ourselves for 6 months. If we went away and then came back and then asked her, and revisited who we are, we probably would see much bigger gain. But because they're subtle, sometimes we just lose patience with ourselves, not recognizing that we actually are making these big changes. They're just happening over time. I think another component is, I was reading on StevePavlina.com. Steve Pavlina is a pretty cool guy. He lives in Vegas, and we actually met up with him one time, and he's just a really interesting dude. He's got a website, a blog that's called Personal Development for Smart People. That's the tagline, right? And he has this great article or blog article that he wrote about being patient with personal development. And he said one of the things he recommends is not seeing it in timelines of 6 months to a year, but actually rather seeing it in timelines of like 5 to 10 years. If you look at yourself and the differences you've made between now and a year ago, it might not feel that drastic. But if you look at the difference between yourself now and like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, then you can see major changes. And one of the things I thought was such a great comment or quote of that article was any characteristic worth developing is worth developing in 10 years or 10 years from now. So if it feels like things are not happening fast enough, just remember that all personal development and growth happens in much longer timelines than we give it credit for. And so don't underestimate how much you can do in that amount of time. Just look at yourself now versus where you were 10 years ago, and you'll see like massive changes. I mean, I have. My life is almost unrecognizable from where it was 10 years ago. So I really think that that's a great reminder when we're trying to be patient with ourselves, working through some of these major issues or changes, or if we're doing healing work, some of the traumas we've gone through. Are we much better at having and holding space for those traumas now than we were, say, 10 years ago? Are we much more further along in our achievement than we were, say, 10 years ago?
I think, and you bringing up Piper and our child and watching her develop at such a young age, we talk to non-parents all the time, and they're like, well, how old, this is back when Piper was first, born, maybe a year and a half old, and they'd say, how old is Piper? And you'd say 18 months old. And I remember people saying, I hate when people put it in months. Like, tell me how many years. Is it 1.5? How many years old is she? Because people that don't have kids don't think in those terms, or don't often think in those terms. And I had the same thing. Before I had kids, I would always think in terms, why are we doing things by month, right? Well, it's because when you're a child, your learning is accelerated so fast. I mean, 1 month matters in a child's life. The difference between 18 months and 19 months can be huge. A lot of kids can learn how to walk in that time period. So we're seeing an exponential. It is over time, but we are seeing it compressed enough to get a pattern here and see, okay, month to month, we're seeing some development. Now, if you did it down to the day, 342 days versus 343 days, it's not an accurate picture of the development of a child because 1 day doesn't matter as much as 1 month does. And as we grow up, we stop doing things in months. When I ask an adult their age, they don't tell me in months or the years in the months. They just tell me how old they are in years. And sometimes when we get into middle age, we don't even talk about the year old we are. We talk about the range of years. Yeah. I'm between the ages of 25 and 45 or right. 30 and 40 or whatever because not much drastic changes during that time. So as we grow up and we get older, time begins to come in longer timelines. We don't have that quick, rapid development. And I think this is something that when Steve Pavlina talks about this, that's what's coming to my mind. It's saying, as grown-ups, we are doing things over a longer timeline. We can't expect things to shift so dramatically on a day or a month level, or even a year level at that point. I mean, we have talked to some kids that are like 18, 19 years old, and the difference between an 18-year-old and a 19-year-old is kind of like the difference between an 18-month-old and a 19-month-old. It's such a drastic change. But the difference between a 35-year-old and a 36-year-old isn't as drastic. But the difference between a 35-year-old and a 45-year-old can be drastic based on your life and the changes over those 10-year periods. So I think what ends up happening on just a growing up level, in general terms, is timelines stretch out further for big changes to happen. And I think that applies to personal growth as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When you said the difference between 18 and 19 months, a kid could learn how to walk, you meant like a kid could learn how to walk in a month timeline. You didn't actually mean that they start learning how to walk at 18 months, right?
I don't know. Maybe, 8 to 9 months. What am I saying? Yeah, of course.
The only reason why I'm saying that is because every single parent of a toddler went, don't you mean 8 to 9 months? So I'm just acknowledging that for every person who was like, what does he mean 18 to 19 months? No, so I'm doing that in behalf of other people who probably would be thinking that.
Thank you for bringing the accurate part of this. I'm trying to get the impression of something, but thank you so much for being accurate because I know if you're listening and you've got a child, you're saying, what is he talking about? So thank you very much for that, yeah.
Sorry, I know that I probably sound like a dick.
No, it's good.
Anyway, so that aside, no, I totally agree. In fact, this idea of what is the phrase that people overestimate what they can do in a year, but underestimate what they can do in like 5 years or 10 years or whatever the quote is? I think that we get impatient with ourselves because we haven't set accurate expectations. And it's hard to really know, like you said, there's a latency between the work we're doing and sometimes how it evidences in our life. So it becomes really difficult to know how quickly things are supposed to be happening. So in a year, we're like, oh man, I mean, we've even done that. We've had goals that 3 years ago we were hoping would have been met. And just now they're becoming a possibility, right? Yeah. Like how many years have you said, I'm not spending another winter in Western Pennsylvania. I will be spending the winter in Florida this year, right? Like you've been saying that for like 3 winters now or 2 winters.
Yeah.
And this year we're like, I think we're actually going to be able to do it. I think this is the first year that we're really going to be able to spend, the winter snowbirding in Florida. So I think that that's really common, is that we overestimate how much we're going to be able to do in a year. But within 5 years, from the moment you said we're going to be doing this to the moment it's happening, is happening within a 5-year stretch. It's happening at the 3rd year mark. So I think that's really common. We set an expectation for ourselves. We go, I'm totally not going to be doing this. Like by the fall, I want to be blah, 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 right? Whatever is the expectation. And it doesn't happen and get really discouraged. However, if we keep going at it, pretty much within a 3 to 5 year span, we can generally accomplish what we want to accomplish. I think about Personality Hacker and how long I've been working on it and how I totally bought the internet marketing hype early on. I completely 100% bought this whole if you do a successful launch, which launches were huge back in 2010 when I started. A launch is basically when you get, a bunch of people mobilized to pitch whatever program or product that you have online to sell. And I was just sure that all I needed to do was launch. And within 6 months to a year, I'd be like drinking Mai Tais on the beach and, checking out Cabana Boys. And that would be my life, right? And basically the business took about 5 years to become truly profitable. And it's amazing to look back and go, oh my gosh, I really bought that hype. And when it wasn't happening and when I was still a starving artist and it was like still like a struggle to make ends meet. And it was like, am I doing something wrong? I kept asking myself, am I doing something wrong? What am I doing wrong? And the answer was almost everything. I was doing almost everything wrong. And it took me a long time to figure out all those things that I was doing wrong. And then suddenly, you made a suggestion, hey, we should do a podcast a year and a half ago. And I'm like, okay, let's do a podcast. Let's see how it goes. And like, that's been one of the major nodes in the system of our success is that we started a podcast. And then all of a sudden we get attention and people are enjoying it. And now I'm writing blogs that people are actually reading. And it was like, oh my gosh. And how many different things did we try before that in order to generate any success?
I was just talking to you and somebody else the other day. I don't remember who it was. I think I counted... I've had, I think it's 13 failed businesses up to the point of personality hacker. And my sheer tenacity of not giving up has enabled me to be in the place I'm at now because, most people would probably get discouraged after the first or second failure, false start. I wouldn't say they're all abysmal failures. Some got some traction, but they just never really, they petered out faster than they should have or faster than I certainly wanted them to. And it was the tenacity to say, no, I feel like I want to continue doing something big. I do want to have an online business. And it was just a matter of pushing through, finding the right pathway through all of that. And that tenacity has served me well in the last 10 to 15 years because, you learn a lot through that too. I mean, all these false starts, all the naivety you have when you started out, you're going to be drinking Mai Tais and checking out Cabana Boys on the beach type idea. I mean, can you just that alone? Imagine looking back now and thinking you don't even have a desire for that anymore because as we begin to, you might have a desire to check out Cabana Boys on the beach, but
no, I was going to say I have my very own Cabana Boy at home.
Well, there you go. But it's not about building this business anymore to create a passive income and retire and just waste our lives sitting around doing nothing, reading books and watching movies and hanging on the beach. Like, we're doing something, we're going to continue scaling. We've made a commitment to saying, hey, we want to build something really impactful in the world. And we're really excited to do that. So looking back just at your mindset at the time and how different that's come, how the growth has happened there, you could have never predicted where you're at in a growth phase back that far. And sticking with something in the midst of the slowness it seems to be. It's like, this feels so slow. When's this going to happen? When's this going to happen? And it has happened. It's just taken longer than you were expecting it to.
Yeah, totally. And I think of other personal development, projects that I've worked on. I was doing personal development in my 20s when I was a complete and total basket case. Like, I was just such a mess in my 20s. And I realized I never wanted to be a mess. A lot of the mistakes that I made it was just my like sort of flailing wildly to try to figure out something that worked. And all of that mess was actually personal development for me. It just took me a long time to figure it out. I was really grappling with the concept of integrity throughout my 20s, and I didn't know it at the time because I hadn't named my personal development projects yet. And it took me a long time to get to a place where I actually was in integrity with myself. And it just took a long time. However, I look back now and I'm so much further along than I used to be in my 20s. And it took me a while to get there. And it was a lot of mistakes. And it was a lot of me, figuring out how to manage my energy and how to manage relationships and how to be true to myself and show up in the best way possible, even though I knew that was going to actually harm a lot of my relationships because people didn't want me showing up the way that I needed to show up. They wanted me to show up how they wanted me to show up. So there were so many different things that I had to figure out. And like I said, now that I'm 37 years old now, and my life, who I am internally is almost unrecognizable from who I was when I was 27. So even when I didn't know I was doing personal development, I was doing personal development. So I think this idea of like, how do you survive while making changes when the changes are happening slowly? Or how do you survive when it doesn't feel like you can even make changes? I don't really know if that's possible to not make changes in your life. I mean, the only thing I can think of is if you've been thrown in prison and you really honestly cannot physically move from your location by law. That's the only way I could really think about it. Or, but even people who are like imprisoned by their health, right? Or imprisoned by their circumstances, even they make changes over time, right? Like, and especially if you're looking at a 5 to 10 year span. And I think it's just a matter of being realistic with your expectations and making sure you're getting your current needs met to the best of your ability. If you can get those needs met, right? Like maybe they're not like big, major, change the world, have extraordinary impact needs. Maybe they're just, maybe you're really introverted and you just need more introverted time. Or maybe you're really extroverted and you need more relationships around you. Maybe you need to be doing more fulfilling work in your life. Or maybe, like whatever is the small change that you need to make, just make sure that you're making those incremental changes as you have your eye on the bigger picture and recognize that the incremental changes, those happen a lot more quickly and that the bigger picture changes happen over time.
Yeah. And as you're talking about this, so what's coming up for me is our culture, at least here in the West, the United States, I'm guessing Europe in a lot of ways. So we have a marketing culture, we've got a news cycle culture, we have just a relational culture of focusing on the things that are broken all the time. And when they're fixed, it's kind of like the metaphor, like no one appreciates people doing the dishes in the house until they're not done. And then everybody's focused on, why aren't these dishes done? Whoever's responsibility was that night, right? It's kind of like no one realized, like you almost for yourself, as progress is happening, sometimes we don't recognize it because it's like, well, that's not appropriate to recognize the good things that are happening. I need to keep focusing on the things I got to keep fixing. And so a lot of it comes down to just like rewarding and celebrating the things where you have come from, even in the midst of when they haven't always been perfect. So I have times in my life recently, and I'm not going to go into detail right here, but I've had a time in my life where I had a really difficult, I'll call it an explosion moment. It was, a moment where I was having some personal stuff come up for me, and I was in a really bad way, and I was acting in a bad fashion. And at the end of it, I was embarrassed. I felt silly. I felt stupid because I was exploding at you and some other people around me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so dumb. I'm so stupid. Why am, and I initially start focusing on all the stuff that's still broken. And then in the midst of that, I said, but wait a minute, there's 2 things I did here that are different than what I would have done 3 years ago. And for those things, I'm going to give myself credit. I've scaled up on these 2 things here. Yeah, I still behaved badly. I still did some crappy things right here. And I had to apologize to some people I exploded around. And I got really emotional and intense. This doesn't happen very often. When it does, it's like, But then I was like, but look at the good stuff that came from this. And 3 years ago, I would have not done those 2 good things that came out of this. And I relished in it and said, I want more of that. I want more of that in my life. And when these times come up, I'm going to try to remember the positive stuff I did here and reward myself. Say, this is good. This is positive. I think I did well here on these 2 things, and I think I can add that more into all my experiences when this might come up for me again. So I think that's part of it is our culture. You watch the nightly news or you watch the news or you read news articles. They're not talking about all the positive stuff in the world. They're talking about the negative stuff. Or you talk about personal development. You're like, okay, what's broken in my life? What do I got to fix? I got to get coaching around this. I got to read a book about this. But there's also good stuff that's happening. And I think reinforcing that positive stuff is really helpful to keep you motivated and encouraged to see that progress happening, even if it's just incremental.
Yeah, no question. When I was talking to Teresa, she's an INFJ, and she was saying that one of the things that she had recently done was she had actually said no to a social obligation when she would have always in the past felt a lot of pressure to say yes. And she was like, no, I need some time and space for myself. And she used the word celebrate. She's like, I really, I was trying to celebrate myself from having that boundary and for being able to say no. And I was like, absolutely. I was like, throw the confetti. That is massive. That is huge. Just being able to do that, just being able to have gotten to a place where you would have been on autopilot, on autoresponder to say yes. And you like had a moment of thoughtfulness and you said, yeah, I actually think I'm going to say no to this and I'm going to not apologize for it. And it prompted a conversation with the people in her life to be able to respect her boundaries in general, right? Like just being able to say no to that one event actually prompted a conversation where now she's going to be in a better space to say no other times and get a lot less pressure from the people in her life. So that's huge, right? Like that's enormous, especially if saying yes was removing your ability to work on other stuff in your life. And that's the other thing to remember is that all these things are systemic, right? Like you say yes to one or no, or you set a boundary, or you work on something, or you make something happen in one component of your life. And then all of a sudden now you're noticing that other parts of your life are getting a little easier. And that's also a part of what you're talking about, that sometimes it's not super obvious immediately because there's like degrees of separation from the result. And that's because these are all systems. And when you change a node in the system, right, when something works differently, now the dynamics between all these nodes change. And now you're noticing that the emergence, which might not feel like they have any direct correlation to this action you took over here, you're noticing a lot more positive emergence in general. And it might take you a while to sort of connect the dots. It might take you a while to figure out that you're actually having, like, say, greater, like you're having greater job satisfaction because you taught yourself the discipline of saying no to social obligations, right? And that carried over into your job. And now you're getting a lot more realistic with when you're saying yes and no in your job context. So sometimes they have these degrees of separation, but if you can keep your finger on the pulse of that and go, I think in general, my life is getting better. Like I think sort of this rising tide raises all ships, as you say, is happening in my personal development in my life. Like my positive personal relationships are impacting my work relationships, or my work relationships or my relationship to my job are impacting my energy levels. So now I can have more energy to develop more positive relationships outside of the work. Like all these things just are interconnected. So celebrating those little moments, right, and encouraging yourself to keep going in those little moments absolutely will play out in these other components of your life. And now you'll see your overall happiness increasing.
Things are way more interconnected than we realize in life. And if you listen back to our podcast on systems thinking and how we believe there's not such a thing as cause and effect, but everything's an emergent property of a system running. In other words, like Antonia's talking about here, there's all these pieces that are interplaying with each other to create the emergent that's happening, to create the thing that's happening, right? It's not just one thing that's causing it. And even in theory, we're talking about systems thinking. And Tony and I and you have already had this conversation on a previous podcast, right? We've already talked about this. 3 of us have already talked about this. However, it's still something that, like, as much as you can talk about in theory, you just have to realize things are more interconnected than you realize. And sometimes when you're working on something, things don't get good. They also can get bad because you're working on something and you're like, wait a minute, I did this thing I thought was going to improve my life. Here, I feel like I'm going 5 steps backwards. I just said this, I don't remember what it was about yesterday. I think I was saying this yesterday. I'm like, I feel like we made 1 step forward and 3 steps back on this. I can't remember exactly what it was. It may not be appropriate topic for this conversation, but
I think it would actually be a great example if you're willing to go to that place.
I don't remember what it was around.
I totally remember.
I don't know if I'll be like, that's really personal or whatever. So if you want to risk it, yeah, let's do it. Let's go right into it.
I'll launch into this because this is yours and my personal development. Okay. I think this is a great example of what we're talking about. And if we get too personal, maybe we'll just go back and edit. And maybe we won't. And if we don't edit, then you'll know that it wasn't too personal. So I'll be totally transparent and mention one of my my long-term personal development projects, possibly one of the biggest ones in my life. So when I was young, around 16 years old, I developed, and I know that this is a label and this is a narrative and a story, and I fully recognize that. And also it is the narrative label story that I've been contending with ever since. But I developed what is called body dysmorphic disorder, which is, in sort of a Cliff Notes version, I believed I was too ugly to be loved. And so this story has carried with me for a long time, which is whenever I'm in a relationship with somebody, or even whenever like something would happen career-wise, or basically anything bad that ever happened to me, I used to say I'd throw it in my BDD basket, right? BDD is the acronym for body dysmorphic disorder. And I would just throw it in that basket, meaning that anytime that anything happened that wasn't good, I just assumed it was because I was ugly, right? And that's why it didn't happen. Like bad things always happen to me because I'm ugly, and good things could never happen to me because I'm ugly. Okay. So nothing in my life reflected this back to me. This was just a story that I was carrying with me for, a number of different reasons. And it's very easy for women in this, in Western society to develop a sense of dysmorphia because of images and because of feedback that they get from, I don't know, one person who maybe didn't even intend to make an offhanded comment, but it totally gets integrated into the story of, the woman has. And I've noticed men have the same thing. But not to go too far down that road, but just to kind of more stick with the road of or the topic of what I've been dealing with. One of the things that came up in our relationship was this sense that I had never actually truly felt the feeling of jealousy before. But now that we're in a pair bond relationship, and this is this is definitely, as far as I'm concerned, this is meant to be, I feel a lot more jealousy in our relationship. And I have been contending with body dysmorphic disorder. I've been when Piper was born, the first thing I thought is, oh crap, I'm going to give it to her, right? All my stories. So I've been working really hard. I was working hard on it before, but I've been working really hard on it ever since Piper was born, because I don't want to unconsciously give her this narrative. I don't want her dealing with this, right? And it's just a story, so I don't want to hand this story over to my daughter. So I've been working really hard on it. So just recently, I feel like I had a level up moment. I just stopped and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I'm ugly. I think I'm actually kind of sexy. Right? And I use the word sexy specifically because I don't think I'm beautiful. I don't think I'm pretty, but I do think there's something about me. And not for everybody. I'm not everybody's cup of tea for a certainty. I can tell that. And that might be more personality than anything else. But I was like, I think I might be sexy. And I was feeling really good about that. So we had this really, really vulnerable conversation where we have friends who are, they're quite a bit younger than us and they look up to us, and, they've, a few of them are female, and they've been kind of hanging around the house a lot. And I mean, at least a couple of them are just really beautiful girls. I mean, they're just breathtaking, and they're in the prime of their life when it comes to beauty, and they've just kind of been hanging around. And I haven't really felt bad about this until recently, when we had a conversation where you indicated that you found at least one of them very attractive, very physically attractive. And I held space for it, and I was in a really good space, and we were having this really vulnerable conversation around masculinity and femininity and beauty and what it means to be attracted to somebody versus just thinking somebody's beautiful. And it was just it was probably the most far down that intimacy road that you and I have ever been able to go, because of a lot of my hangups and some of your hangups too. But my hangups are definitely the big feature and not going down that road. So we have this super radically honest conversation around beauty and girls and checking women out and feeling permission to do that, and me holding space for it, and then at the same time recognizing that you love me. And so I mean we're talking really, really triggering conversation, and I'm cool. And the last thing I say before basically we end the conversation for the night is I realized that it's actually not beauty that's the important thing, that I am the most beautiful woman in the world to you, even if I'm not the most beautiful woman sort of in an objective sense to you. I am the most beautiful woman in the world because if one of these other people walked out of your life and you never saw them again, you wouldn't even blink. But if I walked out of your life, you would be in the fetal position, sobbing and sucking your thumb.
It's true.
So I am the most beautiful woman in the world because when there's nobody else you want to see walking through the door as much as you want to see me walking through the door, right?
That's absolutely true.
Okay. So this whole story, I hope this is not a boring anecdote to other people, but so this whole story is to say that the very next day, I didn't feel that way when I woke up the next morning. I felt that way the night before when I was in this massive, I've scaled up, I've leveled up phase. But the next morning I wake up and the first thing I can think, the first thing I think of is the comment you made about a person in her life who you think is exceptionally beautiful. And it just puts me in this foul mood, right? I just wake up with this thought and I'm going through the world and I'm just by 2:00 in the afternoon, I'm on Craigslist looking for apartments, right? Because I'm moving out. I'm done with this. This is bullshit. You can't treat me that way. I'm just in this horrible space. And you look at me and you're like, oh my gosh, I just revealed incredibly intimate moments and incredibly intimate things to you. And you are totally weaponizing them and you are totally twisting them. And I'm talking about things that you didn't even say, and I'm twisting everything in the worst possible way. And you're like, I didn't say that. And I'm like, oh yeah, you totally did, because I'm inferring all this nasty stuff. And and I'm out, right? The relationship is over, I'm moving out, right? And that's when you said, I feel like we took 1 step forward and 3 steps back. And in the course of that conversation, we realized a couple different things. And by the way, the next morning, I was back to being leveled up. It was almost like I had gone through this purification process, and all the dross, I'm purifying gold, and all the dross just comes bubbling to the top. And we had to acknowledge it, and we had to wipe it away.
Yeah.
We had to go, I had to have that one day in my scale up moment where I was just totally off my rocker insane and implying all sorts of things or inferring all sorts of things you were not implying, and projecting onto you all sorts of nastiness and just gross stuff. And we just I had to contend with it. And you're like, well, I don't feel like I want to tell you anything anymore, because if I do, you're going to weaponize it. And then after a little bit of conversation, we were like, well, then I have to weaponize it, because we have to acknowledge that's what I'm doing. So if we really want to have intimacy, if we really want to be connecting to each other, we can't go, well, I can't share that information with you because you're just going to weaponize it. We have to have the moment of sharing, and then we have to have the moment of weaponization. We have to have all of it if we're going to be really, truly connected and intimate. We have to have those icky conversations, and we have to have that feeling of stepping, 1 step forward, 3 steps back. And the following day, once we got all that stuff cleared out, it felt like it went back to pure gold. Because ever since then, this has been a big thing for both of us.
Yeah.
And it really, really feels like we entered a new space in our relationship. It feels like we just went to this really intimate space that we'd never been to before, because I finally had to level up, and then I had a breakdown.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to go into all the detail. I think we can probably do a podcast at some point in the future where we actually go into all the specifics. But what also, in the midst of your scaling up through this BDD stuff you were going through, I'm also working on some things that are directly impacting that. So I have some scale up stuff that I'm doing as well that this is a challenge for. I'm challenging you with my development. You're challenging me with your development. And so part of the reason why this was so impactful is because for me to admit that I find somebody attractive to my wife is something that's a very much a scale up moment for me, because I was in a relationship that was not okay. I was physically, verbally, and mentally abused for things I didn't even do, or things it was a very difficult thing for me. And again, we can go into a lot more detail in a future podcast. I think it would be a really good one. It'd be a pretty vulnerable one. So I want to make sure we're both in a good space to do that, because this is pretty recent. I mean, this didn't happen it was just a couple days ago. So
yeah, super
recent for you. So I'm kind of being a little bit more protective of us right now in this moment. However, I will say, I remember thinking to myself, I even said this comment to you. I said, it's almost like the universe is testing you to see if you really did scale up, to see if it was, to see if oh, you think you've scaled up? Well, let me throw this at you, and bam, like a punch, a right hook in the face. And it's like, wow, where did that come from? And in the middle of that conversation, some of the things I've been scaling up with, I felt like I'd gotten punched in the face too. I'm like, whoa, wait, maybe I didn't get this hand. Maybe this is still an issue for me. And I'm bracing myself, because I'm guessing some of this stuff might still come out in the midst of us working through some of this. And I think that goes back to the whole premise of this podcast is you're going to have false starts. You're going to have setbacks. You're going to have things that you're like, why am I still struggling? I just had this amazing weekend. I went away to this conference. I learned all this new stuff. Or I downloaded, the owner's manual from Personality Hacker and Intuitive Awakening, and I feel alive. I feel invigorated. I spent the whole weekend going through this course or this program, and I feel like a renewed sense of self. And then you get to work on Monday morning, and you feel like somebody punched you in the face, and then it feels like, oh, maybe I didn't actually level up. Maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe this progress I thought I was making is a bunch of bullcrap. Maybe it's just me delusional. And I would encourage you to say, wait a minute, it could still be a level up. It could just be the universe or my internal processes just really challenging me to see how much I've actually done that. They're testing me. They're testing the limits of the scale up I think I've done. So I think that really plays into this idea of being patient, of hanging in there, even in the midst of what seems like intense setbacks. I mean, when you're doing that, we're both talking and we're crying and it's upsetting. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm thinking through my head, it's all over. We're done. She's looking for an apartment. What is going on? And I'm I'm starting to panic in my mind. Like, what happened? I thought we were doing well. I thought we were in a scale up moment. I thought we were actually growing past this. We just had this amazing vulnerable time. And here it's actually gotten worse. Everything's crashing down and burning around me. And I wish I'd never even gone down the road of trying to be vulnerable, trying to scale up. That was so stupid. I've got all these narratives running now, and like, I'm beating myself up, and I'm saying we're dumb for doing this. And yet the way out is through, and we both stuck with it, and we held in that. And it was literally like being bounced around in a washing machine. It was like a really emotionally difficult experience. I don't know if I'm still recovered from it, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a tough thing. And I think that was the comment. You're right. That was when I said one step forward, 3 steps back. And how do we, and you're listening here and you're probably asking yourself, okay, how do you grow through that? How do you stay present in the moment of that difficulty? And, that I think one of the things that helped us in the midst of that is, and something that you mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, it's about discipline, not the result. Like, if you're building a house, let's say you're the carpenter on the house and you're putting up walls, it's not so much about building the walls. It's about improving the technique of how you swing a hammer and pound nails in, right? And that's kind of more, I don't know if that metaphor exactly correlates, but that's more about what it's like. And I think we've built disciplines around the mechanics of getting through difficult times and the mechanics of personal growth. Even if we don't know exactly what's happening in the moment, we had the mechanics of being able to like reset or reframe or change tact in the middle of that. And it's not to pat ourselves on the back. I will celebrate and say I think we did a good job in this, but it was certainly a painful experience. It was certainly a challenge for us, but we had built some skill around those mechanics. And I think that's a key in all of this. In the scale up moments, when you're losing patience, when you feel like you've got setbacks, when you feel like the world's punching you in the face, it's like those mechanics you've built, you can rely upon those to help you get through those tough times.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I've noticed is that the more personal development we do, the easier it is to do the next one, because we are building techniques around development in and of itself, not just building certain characteristics or virtues or getting through issues or whatever it is. We're building skill at just handling them in general. So I think that the major setback that happened was so much, it went so much faster. We got through it so much quicker. We were on the other side of it so much faster. I mean, I think from the time that I actually exploded to the moment when we were like holding each other's hands and like crying and like kissing each other, being like, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I was such a crazy person there. Like, I think it was probably within a 2-hour span. Like, it happened fast. Whereas I think in the past that would have been like an all-nighter. Right? Like, that would have been like a 10-hour conversation or whatever. And it was just because I just hit this moment where I was like, why am I choosing misery? Why am I choosing that? Why am I not choosing happiness? And because I've taught myself to ask that question, then I did my best to navigate back to happiness and navigate back to an intimate space, which I didn't have that skill built up in the past. So I think that things just happen faster in general. And you can see that popping up in all areas of life. Things are just happening faster. So I think one of the best ways to have patience through the development process is to notice, like, have those celebrations, those little celebrations of like, hey, I was able to say no when before I would have said yes, and I was able to stick firm with a boundary and I was able to get a need met, right? Well, that's building the skill of that in general, and that should be celebrated, because the next time it will be so much easier to say no instead of yes, or vice versa. Say yes to something you would normally say no to, and say yes to an opportunity that maybe you'd be scared to do in the past. So I think that's really important to celebrate those things, and then recognize that it is a long game. It is not short. It is not a short timeline. I have been dealing with body dysmorphic disorder for 20 years. And I finally had a scale up moment when I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be dealing with this anymore. And I've had other moments when I'm like, oh, I feel so much better about myself and I don't really feel that way. But then I kind of brace myself for the next time that it comes up. And not now. I really do feel like I finally graduated. There was just a moment when I'm like, I think I'm done. I think I'm done with this. And then the next day, what was crazy about the next day is that I wasn't back to thinking I was ugly. I was thinking I was attractive and you're not allowed to treat me that way. So it was like a brand new thought that I'd never had before. And I was like, wait a minute, how is he treating me? He's not treating me in any way that's bad. Like, he's treating me perfectly acceptable. But it was like I had this newfound understanding or this new tool in my hand. And then I was just massively clumsy with it. I was like, oh, look, a hammer. I've never had a hammer before. Let me just start pounding things around me with it. So I think that's another piece, is that when we scale up, we get these new skills and tools, right? Like that we add to our arsenal. And now we have to learn how to use those. So I don't know. I really feel like in the development process, if you really are committed to it, if you really are committed to building these disciplines, I think that I can't imagine that you wouldn't see return. I can't imagine that you wouldn't see gain, because it is a process and it just happens over time.
Well, like you said, you had a realization like, and by the way, you are beautiful. I don't know why you said you're not beautiful. You're only sexy. You're sexy and beautiful. It's crazy talk here. But you had this skill up moment of saying, okay, so I am no longer dealing with this image of myself that I'm unlovable, I'm ugly, nobody would find me attractive. And you got over that, and then you were in the vein of, okay, I'm attracted. He can't treat me that way. What happened was you did have a scale up moment, but what it did is it brought another thing out that was related that you didn't solve in the first iteration of it, and it reared its ugly head right after you had done the scale up. So this is the other thing that happens. And we've talked about this when we talked about the hat model. You know, as you do healing work in your life, some achievement stuff might come out, or as you're doing achievement stuff, some transcendent stuff might come out for you. And you're kind of like in this three-legged race of trying to grow different areas of your life, because as you grow one, it exposes all the cracks in the other areas. And I think that's the other thing to remember is it may not feel like progress, but that was actually progress. In the moment, it felt awful. It felt like we did take 3 steps back. It felt like you were like completely melting down and regressing. But as we look at this now, post gaming it, right? We're armchair quarterbacking the experience, and we're saying, look at what happened there. Another issue that came up, a sideline issue that you weren't even able to look at or deal with because your premise was wrong. Now you fixed the premise, and now some other stuff's come up for you. Now let's deal with that too. Mm-hmm. And so as you're listening, as you're hearing this conversation with us, this is something that might come up for you. It might feel so much like you're losing ground when actually just take a step back and see where it is that you are gaining ground. And again, that patience comes in to say, wow, I am gaining ground here. This is great. I did scale up here. This isn't a bad thing, but some other stuff came out of it now. It's all systemic, and that's just part of that process. That's part of that, cleansing it through or moving it through, or however we want to phrase that.
Yeah. And again, I think thinking in 5 to 10 year timelines is so much more optimistic, right? Or like there's so much more to celebrate in a 5 to 10 year timeline than there is maybe in a 6 month to 1 year. Again, this is a 2 decades for me. This is 20 years. And so this timeline was long. This was a long one for me. And I think really celebrating that right now is very important for me to do, and also to recognize that it just takes time sometimes. The same article that I was reading on Steve Pavlina's blog said, you might as well keep going, because the 5 to 10 years is going to keep going anyway. Like, you're going to be aging 5 to 10 years from now. So time is going anyway. So you might as well fill it with positive stuff. Like, if you can't see the return now, if it's not going to be coming for 10 years, that doesn't mean you just don't do anything, because 10 years is coming down the line pretty soon. So you might as well have in 10 years seen the return on that. I think another thing that's really important to remember too is that when we see other people that we believe are gurus or have arrived, it's very important to remember that the ones who actually got to a place that, we're using for inspiration, it took them a long time too. It took them a lot of study. It took them a lot of books. It took them a lot of seminars, events. It took them a ton of time to get there. And they're not arrived, right? If you're using us as inspiration, first of all, that's awesome. And thank you for thinking of us as being inspiring to you. And also, clearly we're not arrived, because we'll have some pretty bad moments in our life that we can't help but be transparent about. Like, we're still on this road ourselves. This is still a process and a journey for us as well. And we have these wonderful scale up moments, but the scale up moments are there because we needed to scale up. Like, we needed the work that we did in order to get to those moments. So just remember that nobody's arrived. We're all on this path. And it's dangerous to see somebody as having just gotten there, because it's so easy to superimpose a timeline onto what we imagine their arrival was. It's so easy to see that they, to think that maybe they just did it overnight. Nobody's overnight. For everyone, it's a long game timeline. So I do highly recommend that you be realistic with your expectations, that you see longer timelines, that when you see a guru or, just a mentor or just somebody that you really find personally inspirational, remember they're on the same path that you are. And to remember that time is going to go by no matter what. So as Steve Pavlina says, any characteristic worth developing is worth developing in 10 years. So just, celebrate the small stuff, make sure that you're doing energy management, and make sure that you are giving yourself enough positive reinforcement and keeping your eye on the different ways in which your life is improving based on the work that you're doing now.
Absolutely. So thanks for being with us this week, and thanks for hanging in here as we get somewhat vulnerable with you. And what do you think, though? Can you come over to personalityhacker.com? Let us know under the comments under this podcast, comments, questions, things that are coming up for you as we're talking. We would love to hear your feedback. And again, personalityhacker.com, or you can come over to our Facebook page, facebook.com/personalityhacker, or twitter.com/personalityhack. We'd love to see you around and meet you and have you part of the community and the discussion.
Actually, that makes me think of something. Is it okay if I mention it now?
Sure.
Okay. So one thing that I have been getting some requests for is the question of, is there any sort of personality hacker meetup that happens in various places where there might be fans, like people who are like-minded, who are into the same thing, personality development? Where can they find like-minded people? Like, is there a meetup, or, how does that work? And so we've been getting more of these requests in general, like, how do I find people in my area that I can meet up with, that we can have these kinds of conversations with? And the answer is, we would love to know if there's a demand for that. We would love to know if people are really interested in that, because if they are, then on our end, we'll do what we can to facilitate such of a thing. So if that's something that's interesting or intriguing to you, we would love for you to go to personalityhacker.com. Under this blog, this podcast, there will be a place for commenting, and let us know if that's something that you'd be interested in. Or the Facebook page, Facebook.com/personality hacker. Go to the Facebook page and say, I would totally dig a meetup, or to find like-minded people in the area. And then we'll do what we can to see if we can facilitate that.
I've had a dream for a while to hit the road with the podcast and come to your city and have you invite friends and people that you know, and we could do a live podcast in your city somewhere in the world. Maybe you have to start small at first, but do live, meet and greet podcasts where there's a studio audience and we've got questions and answer time, and Antonia and I talk, and we could go around and basically connect with you in person and meet you face to face. That'd be a dream of mine, and I think Antonia as well, and we would love to do that. So let us know some feedback on that. Let us know what you're thinking along those lines, and maybe we can talk about it.
Yeah, and if you like our podcast, please subscribe to us. You can do so on iTunes or various Android platforms. If you like what you hear or not, or whatever, if you just want to leave a review, let us know what you think on iTunes. And I do believe that there are feedback and review mechanisms on other Android platforms, but I don't think they're as centralized. So iTunes is generally the best place to leave some feedback, so please feel free to do that.
Absolutely. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.